Allan Hawke, Rob Ayson, welcome to ASPI. 26 years after the great breach, the death of the ANZUS Treaty, Allan, have Australia and New Zealand finally gone past those echoes of that traumatic time and now able to think about a new set of military relationships?
I think we have, Graeme, most particularly in the last 12 months or so with the US rebalance, the visit of Panetta to New Zealand, and on the back of the latest Australia-US ministerial talks and the meeting between the Australian and New Zealand Defence Ministers, we have a new game plan altogether.
Has that changed Australia's thinking about New Zealand? What sort of new game plan?
I think it probably has changed Australia's thinking about New Zealand in that there were some residual issues as a result of the breaking up of the ANZUS Treaty, but now that New Zealand has been welcomed back into the fold by the US in fullness, I think our policy makers and ministers are much more open about dealing with New Zealand on both a bilateral basis and also in terms of the nature of the trilateral relationship with the United States.
Rob Ayson, is that the way it feels to New Zealand? Have you been welcomed back into the fold by the US?
Yeah, I mean that, and I think it's also been a case where New Zealand has been keen to have a closer relationship with the US, and this has been a longer term development than the pivot or the rebalancing. It's been going on for some years, but it's intensified in the last couple of years. I think what's important about it too is that we have a closer relationship with the US without any expectation that New Zealand would be required to change elements of its nuclear-free policy, and there isn't a kind of a broader expectation that is a return to an ANZUS-style formal alliance relationship. But that's not to say that there won't be more trilateral cooperation that occurs. So from New Zealand's from the point of view, I think, of a lot of New Zealand thinkers, it's how do you have a really good trilateral relationship, but also bilateral relationship in particular, without engendering those expectations of that full alliance return. Does
New Zealand now have a de facto alliance with the United States?
Yeah, I think so. I've been arguing that for a while, and New Zealand is a strong supporter of the rebalancing. We're now involved in a closer working relationship with the Americans. We have this Washington Declaration, which is about cooperation in the Asia Pacific, and so in that sense, I think there are expectations, even if they're not always there in terms of all the formal documents at times. There is certainly, I think, a sense in which, while we're not full ANZUS partners in the way that we were, we have a very a much closer relationship with Washington than we enjoyed, say, 10 or 20 years ago.
What does Washington expect of New Zealand as a new de facto ally?
Well, it's been interesting because with Mr. Panetta's visit that Allan mentioned, it was done in a way that things that were comfortable for New Zealand to do. So, for example, not expecting us to change that policy, the nuclear policy, but allowing New Zealand vessels to port at Pearl Harbor rather than Waikiki, which was when we went into RIMPAC recently. I think Washington. I think for Washington, the rebalancing is about a set of relationships. It's not just about the defence side, and I think for Washington, it's a situation where it can cooperate effectively with New Zealand. It knows it needs more partners now, partly because of China. And so I think for the US, it's been as much about a willingness to adjust its approach as well. But I think, come a serious problem, Washington may have stronger expectations of New Zealand than perhaps it did 5 or 10 years ago, and that's one of those things that policymakers have to live with. But I don't think Washington expects that New Zealand would discount the importance of its relationship with China. I don't think that's. I think that's just the reality that New Zealand has these other relationships that are important, and I think Washington's aware of that.
Allan Hawke, is it all forgiven if not forgotten? And is Canberra turning its mind to the idea of a reconstituted trilateral relationship with the US and New Zealand?
I don't think it's as overt as that, Graeme. I think it's more subliminal, but I do think it's forgiven and forgotten. certainly among the current generation of policy makers and ministers here. In terms of the trilateral issue, I suspect there may be more discussion between Australia and New Zealand about the nature of our relationships with the United States and where we have similar views and where we have differences and why they are. And I do like what Rob just said about being able to have more than one relationship. There's a big discussion that needs to be had in Australia because some people seem to think it's a binary choice. You're either for the United States or for China. And I don't think that typifies the nature of Australians' relationship with either of those countries. We can do both, and there's no reason we can't do both.
How much do you see, in fact, that being an important part of the normal US-Australia relationship being enclosing New Zealand as well, that in terms of that discussion about China that Australia continually has with the United States, that New Zealand then becomes part of that discussion as well?
Well, I personally would see that as a welcome development, but that's a decision for people above my pay grade in the system, basically.
Rob, is New Zealand ready, do you think, to have that sort of trilateral discussion about China?
Oh, I think there are elements of that going on already informally. I'd be surprised if some of the discussions that have had. There was a meeting at the Pacific Islands Forum that Mrs. Clinton was involved in. Australia and New Zealand were represented. It would be surprising, given China's interest in aid in the Pacific, that China didn't somehow come up. I think I think there are opportunities there, but I think also what that will probably bring out too is that Australia and New Zealand, while we are doing similar things in a sense with China, there are differences in the approach that we take, and that's partly because,
what sort of differences?
Well, I think for example, New Zealand tends to focus on the commercial element of its relationship with China. There's not much of a debate in New Zealand about the strategic side. We don't have that China choice debate in the same way it happens here in Australia. I think also partly because we don't have that strong formal alliance relationship with the US, which has been unbroken for decades here, and a sense of Australia being very strongly attached to that relationship. That also has an impact on the relationships that Australia and New Zealand, the different relationships we have with China. And so for us, things like the free trade agreement, we make a big focus on that. And so I think in that sense you will see different. If Washington is involved in those sort of conversations, you would see differences. I also think it's healthy to think about Australia, New Zealand, US, China cooperation too. Possibilities for cooperation exercises, those sorts of things. New Zealand and Australia both have defence relations with China of different types, and so how do we bring those things together? I think that would be actually a very promising area for discussion as well.
Alan Hawke, how does Australia think differently about some of its regional questions if it's looking at New Zealand in a slightly wider or newer light?
Well, I think we depend to a great deal on the nature of the relationship with New Zealand in relation to the Pacific Island nations. For instance, no accident that New Zealand was there side by side with Australia during the Interfet mission in East Timor. No accident that New Zealand was there when we had the regional assistance mission to the Solomon Islands. No accident that when Niue had that big cyclone, that Australia and New Zealand was partners in the assistance to them. So I think that part of the relationship has always been very good. There are parts of the Pacific Island Forum issue where New Zealand is able to get more traction than we can, and there are parts where we can rather than New Zealand. So it's that cooperative relationship in the interests of the whole of the Pacific Island region, I think, that works so well.
Rob Ayson, do you see that there will be more division of labour between Australia and New Zealand? Is that going to be an easier thing to achieve?
I'm not so sure about the division of labour approach, Graeme, and I think it also depends upon events. I mean, I think it depends upon whether there are new significant security crises in the Pacific, because those have tended to be the things which have emphasised the types of areas where New Zealand need to work and Australia need to work on, and how we do work together in the Pacific. And we're transiting into an era where we're coming out of the Solomons, we're coming out of Timor, also both out of Afghanistan too. And so it's going to be interesting to see how we build those types of relationships in the Pacific when perhaps we're not as committed operationally, as much as we might have been. But yes, I mean, I think there are areas, particularly in the maritime domain, where New Zealand and Australia can do more in terms of their Pacific cooperation. And it partly depends upon then on how much priority New Zealand and Australia both attach to the Pacific in the way we build our forces. And one of the real challenges for Australia, more than New Zealand, because of the types of capabilities that Australia is able to afford and develop, or they may be affording less than it wanted to a few years ago, is that Australia is going to always be, there was always going to be a focus in this country on the bigger stuff in terms of Asia, in terms of advanced maritime capabilities. And some of those capabilities are not the sorts of things you would use to work with New Zealand in the Pacific. So it's a question of, to some extent, New Zealand would the degree of that cooperation will partly depend upon decisions that are made in Canberra as to how important the Pacific will be as a focus for its policy. And that in turn depends partly on the events that occur in the region.
Allan Hawke, as a man who's thought a lot about Australian military capabilities over a long period, is there a New Zealand element in that Australian thinking, or is Australia just not focused on its capabilities in a way that really encompasses New Zealand?
No, there is an element of that in our thinking, and the best I can say is that perhaps you should await the new Defence White Paper in April, May next year, because if you go back and look at Defence White Papers over the year, you can see the evolution in the thinking and declaratory policy about the nature of Australia and New Zealand in that way. And if I may take the opportunity, Graeme, to say one other thing. In trade, the Australia-New Zealand, the Closer Economic Relations Trade Agreement, when that was formed almost 30 years ago, that was a revolution and arguably a model that other nations picked up on. And so next year happens to be the 30th anniversary. There will be a meeting between our two Prime Ministers, and that's the opportunity to get things on the agenda from our discussions today, and hopefully to get some real results and going forward between the two nations.
Allan Hawke, Rob Ayson, thank you very much.
Thank you.